What's up, fellow book nerds, and welcome back to the Fantasy Files, where we talk about all our favorite fantasy series and topics. So I decided to do it. I'm going to talk about the Pariah because I haven't been able to get these opinions out of my head, and I'm just going to put them out into the world and see what happens, even though you all will probably crucify me. But for real, I've had some time away from the book now, and I think I've figured out how I feel about it. So I'm going to do a quick spoiler-free review. But before we start, if you'd like to support us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you think of this video. Gabe and Chris will be back next weekend as we talk about King's Dark Tidings. And then I honestly don't know what our next couple episodes will be like. I've been wanting us to get over to Lightbringer, but I also really want Gabe to read We Men of Ash and Shadow. So we'll see what we come up with, and we will clue you all in when the time comes. Well, without any further delay, let's talk about Anthony Ryan's The Pariah. I was super excited for this book after reading Blood Song by Anthony Ryan, which I absolutely loved. And then I was seeing posts for this book nonstop on my Twitter feed. I thought it was awesome that Anthony was doing a gritty take on a Robin Hood type character in a fantasy world. I pre-ordered it and really gave in to the hype of it all. Before we get into the bulk of my opinions, let me just tell you what the book is about. The book is written in first-person perspective and follows Alwyn Scribe, who is a part of a band of outlaws led by a man who dreams of becoming the next Duke, as it gets revealed very early on that he is the bastard son of the Duke. The band of outlaws are awesome. You get to know these characters over a few chapters, and when they join up with a couple other outlaw families, someone stages a kind of coup, and soldiers show up to basically kill everyone, and Alwyn escapes, not knowing who is dead and who is alive. From there, he is essentially running from one bad situation to the next, always trying to earn his freedom from each situation or capture that he gets caught up in. In the background to Alwyn's world, there are two kings fighting for control of the land, dividing the kingdom, which comes into play more later on in the book. And that's essentially it. He's an outlaw on the run, trying to find sanctuary wherever he can. And if I go much further, I feel like it goes into spoilers. The back of the book summary goes into even more detail, but surprisingly, I would consider it spoilers because everything that happens in the description was stuff that happened well into the second half of the book. So I actually don't recommend reading any summaries online or the back of the book, as odd as that sounds. Suffice to say that it does straight up turn into military fantasy, if you can call it fantasy. So if that's not your thing, then just be aware that is a big part of it. And there's also a very heavy religious storyline that slowly but surely takes over the entire plot. I felt like this religious storyline was even more center stage than it was in Blood Song. The narrator for the audiobook does a good job, although I did slow it down to about 90% or 95%, just to keep track of what was being said. I felt like it was read a little bit fast for me, but most people probably wouldn't have an issue with it. He doesn't really do a wide variety of voices, but puts just enough of a inflection on each one to be able to differentiate speaker one from speaker two. So, despite any other feelings I may have towards this book, Alwyn was a fantastic character. He is abandoned early in life as he was born in a whorehouse. And when he finds himself in the woods as a young child, scared and alone, the famous outlaw Deccan Scarl adopts him into his roaming band of outlaws. We get to watch him grow up on the pages over several years, and it feels very natural. He is a young man that is sure footed, quick witted, thinks for himself, and is eager to learn all manner of things. His moral compass is definitely gray. He has only slight reservations about killing and none about stealing, but he does have a good heart at the center of it all, even if he is sometimes a little selfish. He is often very crafty and sneaky, like a rogue should be, but he's also very human. We see him mess up and struggle on the battlefield, as well as various other parts of his life, and it makes him feel very real. There was just something very grounded about him. I feel like even though this book was written in first person, we still get to see a lot of screen time with all the side characters and get to know them pretty well. I feel like they're pretty fleshed out. And I really enjoyed learning about all the different outlaws and the friends who join Alwyn as he goes along trying to free himself from each situation he gets himself and others into. Okay, so let's start with the good. I honestly really did enjoy this book. I did not DNF it. And usually, if I don't DNF something, then I enjoyed it enough to finish it out and see where it would go. I did enjoy the time that I had with this book. The main driving force for me in the book was Alwyn. I really enjoyed being in his head and watching him grow as a person and seeing how he would resolve each conflict both around him and within himself. I wanted to see where he would end up, and I felt very invested in him as a person. I very much enjoyed this character arc. The prose in this book is absolutely wonderful, and I think that Anthony Ryan is an excellent storyteller who conveys the story to you in such a pleasant and vibrant way. There are many quotable moments throughout this book, like when Alwyn is describing what exhaustion is like, and he says, "True exhaustion is a treacherous thing. It lies to its victim, whispers promises it cannot keep, pretends danger doesn't exist, and all will be right with the world if you just lie here one more minute." And I just love how he describes exhaustion as this kind of demon that feeds on a weakened being. There's lots of these moments throughout the book, and it really fit with Alwyn's character, who is telling us this story at a point much later in the future, when he has become obviously a very learned and astute man. I really, really enjoyed the outlaw storyline and even the few chapters after we got out of that part of the book. I really wish we had gotten the book entirely about his outlaw life because it was by far the most interesting. When I started this book and I was reading all the outlaw stuff, I actually thought this book was going to be in my top 5 favorite reads of the year. That's how much fun I was having with it. But sadly, once it started getting more heavily into the military and religious plot lines, it completely dropped off that list. Let me tell you why. The outlaw stuff and the next few chapters after are so good, in fact, that when the story completely shifts directions, it feels very disconnected, like we're stepping into an entirely different story, and it was very disorienting. After the raid on his band of outlaws, he has this desire for revenge, and he is trying to solve this larger mystery of who sold them out. but he just gets really involved in these other events a few chapters later, namely the religious storyline, that he basically completely gives up on this goal that he was holding on so tightly to for several chapters. From there, the religious storyline takes up the whole rest of the book, all the way to the end, which intermingles with the military storyline. I certainly don't mind religion in fantasy books. Almost every fantasy book has them to some extent, but this was so front and center and directed us away from the outlaw storyline that I was much more interested in. I believe it was John Gwynn who has a blurb on the book saying that it is a gritty tale of betrayal and vengeance. But there was almost none of that in the book. Alwyn kind of goes this completely different direction and is just trying to survive under the control of others for most of the book. I would not say that this is a revenge plot driven book. Why the raid happened and who did it kind of gets explained at the very end, and it's extremely dissatisfying, almost like it was shoved in as an afterthought and feels very rushed. And Alwyn kind of just accepts it at face value after he's been questioning every single thing he's been told the rest of the book. It felt a little out of character for him, and honestly, when that all came full circle, it felt like, oh yeah, I gotta wrap up this thing that I had, like this big question that we all had at the beginning of the book. I gotta like put that in at the end here. It felt very shoehorned in. The ending was kind of meh and a bit confusing. It leaves you on a bit of a cliffhanger, which I really don't mind when it's done particularly well, or maybe in the middle of an already established series. But this book had me rewinding on Audible, like, did I miss something? Was that the end? And it left me very confused. Not to mention, there was also this kind of this romantic plot line that came about at the very end that we had no real hints at earlier in the book. It all just felt very random. So now some of this has to do with my own expectations and hopes for what this book was. But I think I was expecting a gritty rogue slash Robin Hood type story, and that's just not what we get here. We don't really see Alwyn create his own band of outlaws in the proper sense and get revenge or pull a big heist or something. He just gets swept up into all these other events that don't really make sense for his character or where the plot was originally going. Like I mentioned before, it really turns into a medieval military type story and leans into it pretty hard. So this is one of my biggest problems with the book and has been argued to death on Twitter, but I really don't classify this as a fantasy novel. I'm not saying that every fantasy story has to be way over the top with tons of magic and crazy landscapes and orcs and goblins, but this barely had any fantasy elements, and I mean almost none. And this is kind of a trend that's happening now in modern fantasy that really irritates me sometimes, where as long as the characters are in a medieval setting with vague mentions of maybe something supernatural, it's automatically classified as fantasy. This book has two characters it mentioned very briefly at the very end who may have used magic, but even that wasn't super clear. And I feel like they were there so briefly. At that point, it's just fiction. I think that 99% of this book is military historical fiction, which is fine. I'm not saying that that's a bad genre. It's just not at all what I expected from this book and not what I'm personally looking for. It's possible that the next books will bring in magic and other fantasy elements in, but right now it's hard to classify this as real fantasy for me. And honestly, I'm not sure I'll be picking up the second one. All in all, this book clearly just wasn't for me. I definitely had certain expectations going into it, whether they are unfounded or not. There are a lot of people who did enjoy this book, and I firmly believe that people should absolutely be able to like what they like. I just wanted to talk about some of my thoughts on it in case some of you were having the same expectations that I was going into it. Again, Anthony Ryan is a fantastic writer and storyteller, and I enjoyed Bloodsong quite a bit. And I did love the way that he conveyed this story to me through his excellent prose, even though I wasn't a huge fan of most of the story itself. I just don't think this one was what I was looking for in a fantasy book. For me personally, if I was rating this as a fantasy novel, I would rate this as a 5 or maybe a 6 out of 10, just because I did enjoy the beginning. The characters were great, the prose was wonderful, but the really good storyline got sidelined and thrown away, and the fantasy elements just weren't there for me. All right, well, I'm going to wrap it up there. Tell us in the comments below what you thought of this book or whether you think you'll pick it up or not. If you do, I truly hope you enjoy it, honestly. I want everyone to enjoy whatever they're reading, and if this kind of book is totally your thing, more power to you, and don't let me rain on your parade, because that's not what I'm trying to do here at all. Like I said, we'll be back in about a week with our big King's Dark Tidings discussion with Chris and Gabe, and we'll see what comes next. As I mentioned earlier, Gabe is probably about to read We Men of Ash and Shadow, which we've posted a spoiler-free review for, so check that out on our channel. And currently I'm reading the first in the Expanse series, Leviathan Wakes, which I am enjoying immensely and need to convince Gabe to read. So we'll see what we discuss next as a official podcast episode. Again, if you'd like to support the channel, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. You can also keep up with us and all our content on Twitter. Just look up Fantasy Files Podcast or @FilesFantasy and hit that follow button. Thank you all for listening or watching, and until next time.